If you want to know how I made my Edwardian Bustle Pad, then please stick around. Understanding the silhouette for any era is key to achieving that period look. The most associated silhouette with the 1890s are bell-shaped skirts, gored to fit smoothly over the hips. Dresses became more playful with insertion lace, ruffles, and feather details. High necklines were still key, whereas bodices were marked by leg of mutton or jigao sleeves, and the protruding bustle had all but disappeared. But don't think for one moment that 1890s women skimped on padding out their shape to fit the popular silhouette of the time. After seeing Kathy Hayes' bustle pad video, I knew I needed to make one of my own. I also knew I wanted the design to be as simple as possible, so I started researching. I took a closer look at the patterns Kathy found. She found several intriguing yet complicated looking patterns, which I figured would involve some equally as complicated math. The Scott Bustle Pad looked simple enough, so simple in fact that I based my design off of it. And because of the simple design, I felt comfortable enough drafting my own pattern. But the hip pads were more of a guesstimation. I knew I wanted the hip pads to be pretty good size, to fill out the hip gussets of my corset, since I personally don't have a very dynamic hip to waist ratio needed to achieve that iconic Edwardian silhouette. And let me tell you, not every Edwardian woman had sufficient curves to achieve the silhouette either. I started by measuring across the length and width of my bum, and the number I settled on was 21 inches. So I drew a half circle using my 21-inch radius. The hip pads measure 8.5 inches in length and 8.25 inches in width at the widest part of the hip pad, and these measurements do include seam allowance. So let's get sewing. I had a scrap of this teal satin left over from when I made my Edwardian corset. I thought it would make a beautiful matching set of foundational garments. I cut 2 of fabric on the fold for the center back bustle piece and 4 of the hip pieces. I then pinned the satin pieces right sides together. Using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I sewed the 2 smaller hip pads together as well as the larger center back pad. The reason I'm sewing another line of stitching on top of the previous line is because this tension was off on my sewing machine, and I was too much of a lazy bugger to unpick the first line. So with the proper stitching tension, I sewed the seam a 1/4 inch from the raw edge of the fabric. With the tip of my scissors, I snipped into the seam allowance, easing the curves so that when I turn the pieces right side out and iron them, the curves will turn out better. Repeat with all pieces. I turned the hip pad right side out like a sock. Rolling the fabric between my fingers, I iron it flat. Then I ironed out any unsightly creases. For the stuffing, I decided on 4 layers of felt. Here I'm using a synthetic blend of fibers, cutting them down to a 1/4 inch smaller than the finished hip pocket. Of course, wool isn't historically inaccurate. Wool felt is one of the oldest textiles. The location of its origin is much debated. However, it's thought to have been created over 5,000 years ago in Asia. And I repeated the same process for the center back pad as well. I pinned the curved edges of the hip pad in hopes that when I sew the quilted lines, the fabric wouldn't pucker too badly. I was hoping, at least. The puckering still happened, which is unfortunate. I repeated this process on the other hip pad and the center back. For the grommet placement, I measured 4.5 inches inward from the last row of stitching on both the left and right side, but 3 inches above the stitching from the bottom of the bustle. Off screen, I hammered the garments into the bustle on the marks indicated. With polyfill, I lightly stuffed the bustle. With fiberfill, I stuffed the center back pad. I'm taking care not to overfill it, as I spread the fiberfill out thinner in my hands before stuffing it into the pad, spreading it out evenly. It looks like I didn't get one of the grommets hammered in as tightly as I should have, so off camera I went back and hammered on it some more. For the hip pads, I decided to fill them out a bit fuller. The hip cores of my corset are a bit too big for my natural hips, so a bit of extra padding couldn't hurt to help fill them out. I used a pencil, but a wooden skewer would work better to help push around and pack the fiberfill in a bit tighter. For the waist tie, I sewed on a 1/4 inch wide cotton tape to the top of the waist edge, sewing it on over any remaining raw edges, leaving the length of the ties long. With matching thread, I whip stitched the waist edge of the bustle pad closed. The reason I chose whip stitches is if I ever wanted to reopen the seam, the stitching wouldn't be too difficult to rip out. I sewed some thread tacks through the bustle pad to compress the puffiness of the fiberfill. At this point, I'm not too worried about it being too full and puffy. The fiberfill, over time with wear, will compact down. I'd rather not have to rip out my stitches and have to fill it with more or take some out. For the top edges of the hip pads, I bound them with self-bias fabric. I test fitted the bustle pad and determined where I wanted the hip pads to rest and sewed them on with a whip stitch. Just like in Kathy Hayes' video, I chose to put the bustle on under the corset. I like how the corset smooths over the bustle, rounding it out nicely. I have to admit I wasn't sure how much puff this would actually give me, but I like the way the hip pads fill out the gussets of the corset, giving me the appearance of curvier hips, even if the results are subtle. I'm also kicking around the idea of making another bustle to wear on top of the corset, just to accentuate my shape that much more. If you feel like sticking around or just want to see what other adventures I get up to, please consider subscribing. And if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up.